The 11th Night. Mother Hen and Robber Hawk. Jehoshaphat and Marmaduke were whispering together. "Let's try it," said Jehoshaphat. "And see what happens," added Marmaduke. So they tiptoed into the house of the White Wyandottes and placed the big duck's eggs in with the smaller eggs under the setting hen. Mother Hen did not like that. Oh no! She stirred in her nest, all her feathers puffed up, and she looked very much hurt. "Duck, duck, duck," sniffed she scornfully, and to herself she added, "What a mean way to treat a decent respectable hen," for White Wyandottes are very particular and very exclusive. But after the two little imps had tiptoed out of her house, she made the best of a bad matter. She couldn't kick the big duck's eggs out of the nest in the box. The sides of the box were too high. So she settled down on her eggs again. "I must keep my very own warm, anyway," she decided. About 3 weeks later there was much excitement in the house of the White Wyandottes. From the nest in the box came little noises. Chip, chip, chip sounded faintly from inside the eggs. And before the sun climbed over the big gold rooster, who swung on the weather vane on the barn, all the new little chickens had broken their eggs. "How nice it is to be born!" they cheeped together in a merry chorus, as they arrived in the wonderful world. Very proud of her family was Mother Wyandotte when the little yellow balls began to run about. A few days later she was prouder still when they scampered this way and that, pecking at little bugs and ants. They worked hard for their breakfasts and dinners and suppers. Even Father Wyandotte, the great white rooster with the magnificent red comb and curling white plumes on his tail, forgot that other rooster of whom he was so jealous. For the rooster, who was always perched on the weather vane on the barn, was up so high and he shone like gold. But now Father Wyandotte was not jealous. He walked around in his lordly way, cocking his eye at his little yellow sons and daughters as they chased the fat little bugs. At first he would not say just how proud of them he was. He did not like to tell all his feelings at once. Sometimes he thought fighting and crowing better than being a family man. But all of a sudden he flew up on the tallest fence post he could find and flapped his wings. He threw back his head, opened his yellow beak, and crowed up at that gold rooster. "Sure, sure, sure! You couldn't do it! You couldn't do it! Couldn't do it do!" No, the gold rooster on the weather vane on the top of the barn, though he shone like the sun, could neither crow nor raise a family. But Mother Wyandotte didn't bother about anything so high in the sky as the sun and the rooster. She was busy playing nursemaid to her little yellow children and helping them find food. But in the afternoon she did look up at the sky. That was when something like a dark shadow sailed in the air far above the home of the White Wyandottes. It was a great bird with wide stretched wings, much bigger than Jim Crow. He sailed in circles, while his evil eye looked down at the frightened, scampering White Wyandottes. How he would like a nice chicken for lunch! "Robber Hawk!" called all of Mother Hen's uncles and aunts in the barnyard. "Robber Hawk!" screamed all of her great uncles and great aunts too. "Robber Hawk!" screamed all of her cousins, first, second and third. Loud and long barked Rover and Brownie, and little Wienerwurst stopped chasing the pretty pink pigeons. And even Mr. Stuck-up the turkey had to join in the hubbub. "Horrible robber," he gobbled. But Mother Wyandotte had called to her children. She opened her wings and under them quickly in fright they ran, all huddling together. Her wings hardly seemed large enough to cover them all, but she took them all in, every one of her children. She was a nervous old thing, but she was a good mother. And good mother hens, good animal mothers, and our own mothers too, never seem to think of themselves when there is danger around. They just look out for their little ones. "Robber Hawk, robber! Shan't touch 'em, robber!" she said. Then quick as a wink there was another loud noise, just like that day when Jim Crow fell in the cornfield. Bang! Bang! Jehoshaphat, Marmaduke, and Hepzebiah jumped. They looked around. There stood the Toyman with the gun at his shoulder. Little puffs of smoke, like white feathers, floated away from the muzzles of the gun. "Winged him, anyway," cried the Toyman. They looked up. Robber Hawk wasn't sailing in the sky any longer. He was falling, falling like a stone, just like Jim Crow. "The Toyman's a good shot!" exclaimed Jehosophat. "My, how I wish I could shoot like that!" Mother Green came to the back door. She called to the Toyman. "He's fallen on the barn, Frank." "Roof, roof, roof!" barked little Wienerwurst to explain it more clearly. Sure enough, Robber Hawk dropped on the roof of the barn, right by the gold rooster who swung on the weather vane. The Toyman scratched his head. "Quite a climb for these stiff legs," said he. But he fetched a tall ladder and placed it against the side of the barn. The three children watched him, their heads bent back so far that they almost snapped off. Mother held the ladder at the foot, for nobody wanted anything ever to happen to the Toyman. "Careful," she warned him. "All right, Miss Green," he said. "I haven't been up in the maintop for nothing." You see, once upon a time he had been a sailor. There was nothing that the Toyman hadn't done. He reached the top of the ladder, then swung out on the roof. At last he reached the ridge. There stood the gold rooster, never crowing or saying anything at all. And under him lay Robber Hawk, and he didn't say anything either. Carefully the Toyman climbed down from the ridge of the barn, holding the rascal in his hands. Then one by one down the rungs of the ladder he came. When he reached the ground, Jehosophat, Marmaduke and Hepzebiah gathered round. Robber Hawk hung limp from the Toyman's hand. His dark brown feathers never stirred. His white breast, with its dark bars and patches, never moved. "Robber Hawk," spoke the Toyman, "your old curved beak will never feed on any more good chicken." Then he turned to the children. "We must bury him by Jim Crow." So Jehosophat, Marmaduke, Hepzebiah, Rover, Brownie, Wienerwurst and the Toyman marched with Robber Hawk on towards the cornfield. There, by the side of Jim Crow, they buried him. And the Toyman took 2 pieces of wood. On these he cut with his knife, "Jim Crow, killed 1918, thief. Robber Hawk, killed 1918, thief and murderer." At their heads he placed the 2 boards side by side. "There we will leave them," the Toyman spoke sternly, "as a warning to all evildoers." So they walked back slowly to the house of the White Wyandottes, where Mother Hen clucked contentedly once more and all the yellow chickens ran around, chasing the little bugs in their game of hide and seek. A fine game it was, too, only it was more interesting for the chickens than the bugs, you see. The 3 happy children noticed that one of the little yellow fellows was larger than the others. He ting, 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 end that tale to-morrow night. So says the little clock. He must be obeyed. So goodbye for a little while. End of the 11th night. The 12th night. About Ducky the Stepchild and the Little Ship. In the door of the workshop stood the 3 happy children, watching the Toyman. It was one of the very nicest places on the whole farm. Tools of all sorts, bright and sharp, lay on the table. Lumber of every kind lay piled against the walls. The shelves were filled with cans of paint. All the colors of the rainbow were in those cans. The children could tell by the pretty splashes of paint dripping down their sides. Back and forth swung the arms of the Toyman. He was very busy over something very important it must be, for he never talked, only worked and whistled away. "Oh dear, I wish I knew what it was," sighed Marmaduke. Anyway, he knew it was something for them. Father Green had given the Toyman a holiday, all for himself, to do as he liked, and of course he'd make something for them. On the edge of the table was a vise, a big tool with iron jaws. In the iron jaws was a block of wood. The Toyman screwed the vise very tight, so tight the wood couldn't budge. Then he shaved this side of the block, then the other side, with a plane, a tool with a very sharp edge. Clean white shavings fell on the floor, some of them twisting like Hepzebiah's curls. "I wonder what it's going to be," Marmaduke repeated. Jehoshaphat was pretty sure he knew. "I'll bet it's a boat," he said. The Toyman chuckled. "Right you are, son. It's the good ship, well, let's see. All boats have a name, you know. What do you think would be a good name for a fine ship?" Jehoshaphat had one right on the tip of his tongue. "The Arrow." The Toyman thought this over. "That isn't bad," said he. Then he turned to Marmaduke. "What's your idea for a name, little chap?" Marmaduke thought and thought. He looked out through the door and saw the party bird, the vain Peacock, parading up and down, showing off its beautiful tail. And Peacock was the only name he could think of. Jehoshaphat laughed out loud. "That's no name for a boat." And Marmaduke had to shout back, as little boys will, losing his temper, "'Tis too." The Toyman stopped the quarrel, just as he always did, with something pleasant or funny he said. Then he leaned over and picked up 3 chips of wood. "I'll write the names on these little chips," he explained, "and we'll choose." Putting his hand on Hepzebiah's sunny curls, he asked that little girl, "What name do you think would be nice for the boat?" Now Hepzebiah really didn't know just what it was all about, but she had heard Marmaduke say Peacock. So she took her finger out of her mouth just long enough to point at the Guinea Hen, who was screeching horribly out in the barnyard. "The Guinea Hen? Ha ha! That's a good one!" The Toyman was forever saying that, and laughing at the funny things the children said. Hepzebiah, thinking that this was a nice sort of game, took her finger out of her mouth and pointed again, this time out to the pond, where the swans were sailing like pretty white ships themselves. "The very thing!" exclaimed the Toyman. "White Swan's a fine name for a boat." And he wrote White Swan on one chip, Peacock on another, and Arrow on the last. Then he held them towards the children. "The smallest must choose first," he said, and Hepzebiah took one of the little white pieces of wood from the Toyman's hand. He turned it over and read, "White Swan." "We'd go a good ways before we'd get a better name," he decided. "When the boat's all finished and all sails set, she'll sail away just like a swan, you see if she doesn't." The hull of the boat was finished now, and on the bow at the very front he nailed a thin little stick with tiny nails. This was the bowsprit. On the keel at the very bottom he fastened a piece of lead, so she wouldn't turn over, he meant, when her sails were set and the wind blew too hard. Then, choosing some sticks, very carefully, for they must be straight, he tucked the boat under his arm, and with the 3 children close at his heels, walked over to the pond and sat down under the crying tree, where the sun shone bright and warm. Out came the magic knife, and he whittled away at the little sticks, whittled and whistled and smiled all the time. Sliver after sliver of the wood fell on the ground. Sometimes one would drop into the water and float away like a fairy canoe with the green willow leaves that fell from the crying tree. So under the magic knife the little ship grew and grew, till the masts were fitted too, and set fast and tight in the clean smooth deck. "But where are the sails?" asked Jehoshaphat impatiently. A funny answer the Toyman made. He just said, "Hold your horses, sonny." The teacher in the red schoolhouse up the road would have reproved him for this, but the children thought whatever the Toyman said was all right. Of course he meant not to be too impatient, but just then the dinner horn sounded, way out over the pond and over the fields, and the children ran into the house, just as you would have done too. It didn't take long to finish dinner that day. For dessert they had blackberry pie, very juicy and nice, and they didn't even wait to wash the red marks of that pie from their faces, but just ran for the crying tree. The Toyman felt in all his 6 big pockets, and out came needles and thread, and pieces of clean muslin besides. Stitch, stitch, stitch went his fingers, for 1,000 stitches or more, and by the sails were all cut and sewed and fitted on the 3 little masts. Then the Toyman stopped. "We haven't christened her yet," he said. "We should have done that long ago." In his pockets he rummaged again, those pockets which always held just the right thing. It was a small bottle this time, all filled with tiny pink pills. Much nicer these were, the children thought, than that yellow stuff in the big bottle they hated so. The Toyman poured the little pills out. "What's the use of medicine on a nice day like this?" said he, and he filled the bottle with water and put back the stopper. "When ships are launched," he explained, "folks break a bottle over the bow when they name her." "All right, I'll do that," said Jehosophat, but the Toyman stopped him. "Hold on there, sonny. That's the lady's job." Then he called Hepzebiah and gave her the bottle. "Now, little girl, you stand here and say, 'I christen thee White Swan.'" But "I quithin White Thwan" was the best she could do. "Now drop the bottle." She opened her fingers, and sure enough the little bottle fell right on the deck and broke all in little pieces, and the glistening drops splashed over the bow, and so the good ship White Swan got her name. Into the water the Toyman pushed the little ship. The wind filled her sails and off she went, racing away before the wind to join the beautiful birds for whom she had been named. Around the pond and over the bridge went the Toyman, to the other side. When the ship reached the opposite shore he swung it around and sent it back on the return voyage. The White Swan had reached port safely when the Toyman said: "It's funny what different opinions folks have. Some like the water and some don't. Now the swans and the ducks and that little ship, and the fish and the froggies and Uncle Roger and you and I, we think it's fine. But Mr. Stuckup and Miss Crosspatch and Old Mother Wyandotte and Miss Fizzletree, why, they won't go near it at all." "That is funny," said Jehosophat. Then the Toyman added: "Just listen to that." Old Mother Wyandotte was right near them, clucking in fright. Don't you do it," she was calling to one of her children, who was looking longingly at the cool pond. Around her were all her children, fast growing up now. They were all soft and white but one. Like good little chickens they were looking for bugs, all but one. He was the little fellow they had noticed before, the funny little fellow with a longer bill than the rest, and the odd looking feet. His soft downy back was turning black, and he was starting for that pretty water shining in the pond. Jehosophat looked him all over. "Why, he looks like a duck." "What did you expect?" laughed the Toyman. "He is a duck. Old Mother Wyandotte thinks he's her child, but he's only a stepchild. Ha, ha! Somebody must have put another egg in her nest." Over in the garden were pretty flowers called bleeding hearts. They were very pink, and Jehosophat's face turned that very same color. Well, he knew who had stolen into the house of the White Wyandottes and put that big duck's egg under Old Mother Hen. And now it had turned out a real little duckling, that black little fellow Mother Wyandotte was scolding so. Don't you do it," she was shouting still. But little black Ducky had made up his mind. He was headed straight for that shining water. Around Mother Wyandotte gathered all her relatives to talk over the matter. They were disgusted. That one of their family should disgrace them so. "Respectable chickens spend their time on the ground," said Granny Wyandotte with a toss of her comb, "and never, never get wet if they can help it, not even their feet." "True, true, quite true," all the Wyandotte aunties agreed. But their second cousins, and the third cousins too, the ducks and the geese and the swans, said they were wrong. "Little Ducky's a sensible chap. What better place can there be to play in than that nice cool pond?" And all the fishes swimming around, from the big pickerel down to the littlest minnie, waggled their fins and tails to show they agreed too, while the froggies on the lily pad croaked: "Come on, come on." They were giving little Ducky a warm invitation to play in the water, you see. Ducky was right at the edge now, and Mother Hen, who was really his stepmother, made one last appeal, but the ducks one and all called: "Back, back, back." They weren't talking to Ducky, they meant the White Wyandottes. They were taking his part, you see, though not for 1 minute did they guess he was their child, their very own. Duckie appreciated that too. Perhaps old Father Drake, the head of all the Duck family, wouldn't let Stepfather Wyandotte punish him that night if he did try the water. I don't believe Stepfather Wyandotte really cared very much. At first he was a little mad, but after scolding a little he shouted, "Through, through, through! I'm through with you!" He wouldn't have anything more to do with little Duckie. I guess he suspected he was just a stepchild after all. So he grumbled to himself as he speared a fat tumblebug with his beak. I don't care." He had enough children anyway. But the gold rooster on the top of the barn looked down laughing at him. He couldn't really laugh, you know, or flap his wings, but he swung from west to southwest and back again, as if to say, I knew it, they fooled you." Old Father Drake, head of the Duck family, started for the water. Mother Duck and all the little ducks went in too. They were going to show Duckie the way. He just couldn't stand it any longer. So plop, in he went and paddled around after the others, and ducked his head under the water to catch his dinner, just as a real duckling should. "Better than grubbing for bugs in the dirty earth, this nice clean cool water," quacked he, and he was as happy could be. The Toyman was looking at him with a smile on his face. "He's just like me," he said at last, and the children, surprised at that, asked all together, "Who's like you?" "That little duck there." "Like you?" Jehosophat shouted. "Why, he doesn't look like you at all." The Toyman puffed away on his corncob pipe before he answered. "Oh, inside he's the same. I was just like him when I was a kid. I had a stepmother too, and she and all the step uncles and aunts scolded and scolded, and whipped me besides, because I wanted to go to sea on a great big ship." "What did you do?" They didn't really need to ask that question, for hadn't the Toyman been most everywhere, and hadn't he told them many a story about the great sea and the ships? "Yes, they all said I would drown or become a wicked bad man." Marmaduke thought he would like to do something to those step uncles and aunts who treated the Toyman so badly. "They don't know what they're talking about," he shouted. "You're good as anybody in the world." "Thank you, little feller," replied the Toyman, patting his head. "But they said I would, just the same. They talked just like those old Wyandottes there. But I fooled 'em all," he went on. "And one night when it was dark, just a few stars out, I climbed out of bed and jumped out of the window and ran away. I walked and I walked miles and miles, till I came to a big town by the sea. There were lots of big ships at the docks, and I asked a man with a great big beard to take me too. So he took me on board, and I was a little cabin boy. But by and by I got to be a real sailor, and I sailed all over the world in the ship, and saw lots of people, yellow and black and brown, and funny places and queer houses and—" "Be careful, Frank." They all turned at once. There was Mother standing right near them. All the time she had been listening near the Crying Tree. "Now, Frank," she repeated, "be careful or you'll put notions in those children's heads, and some day they'll be running away from me." Still she didn't look cross, and she smiled at the Toyman, especially when he answered, "Not from a mother like you, Miss Green. How about it, kiddies?" And Marmaduke and Jehosophat were very sure they never could run away, not even to sea in a beautiful ship. So they kissed her and hugged her too. Now the froggies were singing their evening song. The sun was getting close to his home in the west. Little Duckie and his real mother and father came out of the water and waddled off towards the barn. The swans folded their wings and came to the shore. So the Toyman brought the ship to the harbour and anchored her for the night. End of the 12th night. The 13th night. The Tall Enemy. It was the first snowfall. The grey sky was filled with little white feathers dancing down, down, down. "Look at the snowflakes!" exclaimed the three happy children, all in one breath. "Yes," said their mother, "the snow is come. In the spring and summer Mother Earth works very hard. It takes so much of her strength feeding the millions of plants from her brown breast. By fall she is very tired, and in winter she takes things quite easy. Then the gentle Rain Fairy feels sorry for Mother Earth. She turns her own tears to snowflakes and scatters them over her. They weave a soft white comforter to keep her warm, and it keeps the seed babies, sleeping in Mother Earth's brown breast, all snug and warm too. All that day and all night the snow fell, and all the next day and the next night, and the third day and the third night too. Then all of a sudden it stopped, and the three happy children woke in the morning and looked out of the window. "Why, the snow's most as high as Wienerwurst's house!" cried Jehosophat. Then they all trooped in to breakfast. "We will make forts," said Jehosophat. "Hurray!" exclaimed Marmaduke. "The very thing," added Mother. And Wienerwurst, curled up by the rosy kitchen stove, barked, "Woof, woof, woof." Now this means a lot of things, but this time it meant "Good, good, good." So the three happy children hurried through their oatmeal. They hurried so fast that they had three little pains. Jehosophat had one right under his belt, Marmaduke one in the center of his blouse, Hepzebiah one under her little red waist. Mother came in from the kitchen. She looked at the empty bowls. "What? All gone already? Look out, or you'll each have to take a big tablespoon of the yellow stuff in that bottle." There it stood on the kitchen mantel. She pointed right at it. They hated it worse than most anything in the world. "I'm all right," said Jehosophat. "And I'm not sick," protested Marmaduke. "And pain's all gone," cried Hepzebiah. It was funny how the sight of that little bottle frightened the three little pains away. Mother smiled. It was a funny smile. Then she said, "Now on with your things." Jehosophat sat on the floor and pulled on his new rubber boots, which reached almost to his waist. On the stool sat Marmaduke, putting on his, and Mother helped little Hepzebiah with her wee little ones. Over Jehosophat's head went a red sweater, over Marmaduke's a green, and over Hepzebiah's curls one of blue. Then wristlets and mittens and coats and caps, and out into the deep white snow they tramped. "Forward, march!" said a voice. They looked. It was the Toyman. "The enemy is about to attack," he explained sternly. "Where's the enemy?" "You can't see them, but they're advancing fast. Up with the fort, double quick!" So at double quick they marched to the barnyard and began work with their shovels. My, how they dug! Fast flew the snow, and the Toyman packed it down hard and shaped it into the walls of a big strong fort. It was odd too how the Toyman could find time to help, for he had lots of work to do. But then the enemy was coming. Rover and Brownie and Wienerwurst scampered around in the snow. They were not of much help. All they did was bark, bark, bark. "Hush!" commanded the Toyman. "We must keep quiet so the enemy won't know where we are." So they dug and packed the snow hard. Soon the walls were as high as Jehosophat's shoulders, and the fort was all ready. The Toyman stopped and said, "Now for the ammunition." "What's ammunition?" "Watch." The Toyman took a handful of snow and crushed it hard between both hands. When he finished he opened his fingers. In his palm was a round white ball. Then another he made, and another, and the three little soldiers, Jehosophat, Marmaduke and Hepzebiah, made lots too. They piled them in the corner of the fort until they had a heap like the iron balls around the cannon in the town park. "Now," commanded the Toyman, "march to the barracks and get warm." He pointed at the house. "All watch and call when the enemy comes." Into the house they went and dried their mittens and warmed their hands, and each had a cup of nice warm milk. After a while there was a loud knock at the door and the sound of a horn. Mother opened the door a little way. The horn sounded again. Then the voice spoke loudly. "Fall in," it said. "The enemy comes." Quickly the three little soldiers put on their mittens and caps and buttoned their coats and hurried to the fort. They looked around. They could not see anybody with a horn, and the Toyman was gone. Over the walls of the fort they peeked. There stood 6 soldiers staring at them. The 6 soldiers stood very still. They were all white, but their eyes were black like pieces of coal, and they stared hard at the 3 little soldiers within the fort. Over their shoulders were 6 long round things. "Guns," said Jehosophat. They looked around for the Toyman. He did not come. Their hearts beat fast. "We're not afraid," shouted Jehosophat at the white soldiers. "Come on, you enemy!" With that they heard a sound far off. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. "What's that?" cried the smallest little soldier, and Captain Jehosophat answered: "Drums, drums! The enemy comes!" Then he laughed. He had made a rhyme, without thinking anything about it. But then he stopped laughing. It was no time for play. There was hard work ahead. Those 6 white soldiers in front of the fort were ready to attack, and there were more coming. "Load!" he commanded. Each little soldier took up a snowball. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. The drums sounded nearer now. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. Around the house came the sound of the drum. Over the walls of the fort they peeked, very carefully. There was a man marching. He looked something like the Toyman. But could it be? No, for he was so changed. The man had a horn around his neck, and a feather in his hat, and his face was stern. He was whistling Yankee Doodle. It sounded like a fife, and all the time he was beating the drum with all his might. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. On through the snow the tall enemy marched. He reached the 6 white soldiers who stood so still, with their guns over their shoulders. He stopped and called out to the 3 little soldiers in the fort in a loud voice: "Surrender, or we attack!" "Never!" was the brave answer of Captain Jehosophat. "Fire!" he commanded, and he let a snowball fly. He hit the tall enemy right in the face. Then Marmaduke let another snowball fly. That hit one of the white soldiers and knocked his black eye out, and Hepzebiah threw her snowball. She tried very hard, but it didn't go very far and didn't do any damage. Jehosophat looked worried at that. He couldn't depend on Hepzebiah at all. That left but 2 of them, against so many. And on came the tall enemy with a feather in his cap, still beating his drum. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. The little soldiers must fight bravely now. Fast flew the snowballs. He was very near. Then Marmaduke picked up the last snowball. He took good aim, for it was the last of their ammunition. Then he let it fly. It hit the tall enemy man right over his heart. He fell in the snow. "You've done for me!" he called in a weak voice. Then the 3 little soldiers shouted and ran out of the fort. There in the snow lay the dying enemy. "You've won," he said in a sad voice. "I surrender." "Hurrah, we've won!" they shouted. Then they stopped. They felt very sorry for the enemy, for after all he had been very brave. They bent over him. Then something happened. All of a sudden the enemy seized the 3 little soldiers in his arms. And he laughed. Yes, he laughed. And he hugged them all at once. And the 3 little soldiers laughed happily too, for the tall enemy had been the Toyman all the time, and the 6 silent soldiers were only made of snow. Behind his heels they trudged into the house. But the Toyman had to carry the littlest soldier in his arms. She was very cold and very tired. But the 3 happy children ate a very good dinner and a very good supper too that day, for they were very hungry. And they had earned it, after the brave fight in the fort. Ting ting! He's always on time, that little clock. So good night. End of the 13th night. The 14th night. The Sleigh and the Tiny Reindeer. Marmaduke had played too long in the snow. He was very wet. He was very cold. And he felt very funny and hot all over. "Mother, my throat's got a rubber ball stuck in it," he said. Mother looked at it. "No, dear, there's no rubber ball there. But your throat's all swollen, and there are little spots in it. You mustn't get up today." Marmaduke lay very still for a while. Soon he heard sleigh bells tinkling past the window, then far down the road. Father had hitched Teddy, the buckskin horse, to the big sleigh and was going for the doctor. Away ticked the clock. After a while, a long time it seemed, Marmaduke heard the sleigh bells again, at first far off, then coming nearer and nearer, until they jingled before the porch, then stopped. He heard voices and the sound of feet upon the porch, shaking off the snow. The door opened and into the bedroom came the doctor. He had a face all rosy from the cold. His eyes were black and so sharp that they looked right through Marmaduke. But they were kind eyes, and his voice had a pleasant chuckle in it. The doctor came and sat on the edge of the bed. "Well, well, how's my little soldier? Wounded in the battle, or just playing possum?" Then Marmaduke opened his eyes. After the doctor had talked a while about lots of different things, before Marmaduke knew it, there was something like a spoon or a shoehorn in his throat, and the doctor was telling him to say "Ah!" "This isn't school," thought Marmaduke. "Why does he make me say that?" But he forgot to be frightened, for the doctor was saying so many funny things all the time. Then he opened his black bag. It was full of little bottles, packed neatly in rows. Marmaduke wished he would forget and leave it behind. It would be fine to play with. Mother brought 2 glasses, and the doctor poured some drops from one bottle into a glass, then from another bottle into another glass. And he said something to Mother in a low voice. Marmaduke could not hear what it was. Then he patted the little soldier on the head and said good bye. Again the sleigh bells sounded, and away he drove. But the sleigh bells never stopped. They kept sounding all the night, long after Teddy was back in his stall and the big sleigh was in the shed. You see, Marmaduke was very sick and out of his head. 7 days passed and 7 nights. He began to feel better, but he was very lonely, for Jehoshaphat and Hepzebiah had gone to Uncle Roger's to stay while he was sick. Very small he felt in the big bed in the front room, and very, very lonely. He looked out of the window at the big elms. They were covered with white snow, like fur. There were many trees standing in rows. The path between them looked like a white road leading up over the hill to the sky. He wished he had someone to talk to. Just then he heard a noise at the door. Tap, tap, tap. It opened just a little. "Who's there?" said Marmaduke. The door opened wider, and he saw the Toyman's kind face. "Hello, little soldier." "'Lo, Toyman," replied the little boy, and his voice sounded very small and very weak. The Toyman sat by the bed a while. Then he got up and stirred the fire. Showers of pretty gold and red sparks scampered up the chimney. After that he spread a paper on the floor, not far from the fireplace. Then his pockets he searched, those big pockets which Mother said were always like 5 and 10 cent stores, they were so full of things. Out came some pieces of wood. Out came his knife, that magic knife with the 5 blades. Marmaduke was always glad when he saw that knife, for then something nice was sure to happen. Up came the big blade and snapped back, and the Toyman began to whittle away. Sometimes he used the big blade, sometimes the small one. Marmaduke watched him, all eyes. And as the Toyman whittled, sometimes he whistled, and sometimes he sang a funny song in a funny voice. You see, he could make rhymes as well as toys. And this is what he sang. The Toyman's Song. When a little boy's sick and stays in bed, and things feel queer inside his head, he cannot work, he cannot play, it's hard to pass the time away. Don't make much fuss and talk a lot, no questions asked 'bout what he's got. They'll ask him that when the doctor comes, so just sit still like good old chums, and take your knife and make him toys. This knife knows what will please small boys. Horses and lions, and tops and rings, and kites and ships, and pretty things. We'll paint 'em red, and yeller and blue. Work away, old knife, he's watchin' you." "That's a new song, and a very nice one," thought Marmaduke, as he watched the Toyman whittling away by the red fire. The little white slivers and shavings covered the paper now. He couldn't see just what that knife was making, but that was nice too, for then it would be a surprise. And there's nothing finer in the world than a real beautiful surprise. Then his head grew very tired, and his eyes began to droop till they were tight shut, and he fell asleep. The Toyman looked at him and smiled. "Poor little feller," he said. Then he closed his knife and picked up the paper and the shavings and the surprise, and out of the room he tiptoed. Out to the workshop he went and opened the door. On the shelves were brushes of different sizes and cans of paint of all colors. He took down 3 of the cans, humming to himself, "We'll paint 'em red and yeller and blue. A little brown would go well too," he added, as he took down another can. He worked away with his paint brushes until the surprise was finished. Then he placed it on the work table to dry. The next afternoon there was another tap at the bedroom door. But Marmaduke didn't answer. He was taking his afternoon nap. So the Toyman slipped in and put the surprise at the foot of the bed. After that he sat by the fire, watching the little sick soldier. He sat very still, stirring the embers just once in a while to keep the room warm. At last Marmaduke opened his eyes. A little at first, then wider. The very first thing that he saw at the bottom of the bed was a tiny sleigh. The body was bright blue and the runners were red. And what do you think? In front, hitched to it, were 2 tiny brown reindeer with yellow horns. They looked so much alive that Marmaduke thought any minute they would start running away. Away over the comforter, out of the window, and up the snow-covered hill. The Toyman came over to the bed. Marmaduke curled his little fingers around his friend's hand. The hand was brown and hard, but it was a nice hand, Marmaduke thought. "We're good old chums, aren't we?" he said to the Toyman. "You bet we are," the Toyman answered. End of the 14th night. The 15th night. Jack Frost and the Man in the Moon. Once, twice, thrice nodded Marmaduke's head. The red flames of the fire kept dancing, dancing all the time. Very bright looked the little sleigh at the foot of the bed. Very brave the tiny reindeer. But look! Something moved, just a little. The nigh little reindeer was stamping his foot and tossing his antlers. And the other little reindeer tossed his horns and stamped his foot too. On their backs the sleigh bells jingled, merrily like fairy bells. The red and blue sleigh moved a little, just a little. It began to slide slowly over the comforter. Marmaduke was worried. He didn't want the pretty sleigh and the reindeer to run away. He might never see them again. "Wait!" he shouted. "Whoa, you villains!" It was a strange little voice that ordered the reindeer. The red and blue sleigh stopped short. Marmaduke rubbed his eyes. The strange little voice spoke again. "Jump in," it said. And there in the front seat of the toy sleigh sat a funny little chap about as big as the Toyman's thumb, no bigger. He wore a pointed cap that shone like tinsel on a Christmas tree. He wore a white coat that sparkled too. "Who are you?" asked the little sick boy. "That's my sleigh. You shan't run off with it." The funny little voice under the white cap answered. "Jump in then, and take a ride." "Tell me who you are first," Marmaduke insisted. "My name's Jack." "Jack what?" "Jack Frost. You ought to know that." Tinkle, tinkle went the bells. The reindeer lifted their hooves higher and pawed at the comforter. They shook their antlers impatiently. The little driver jumped up and down in the seat as if he were sitting on pins and needles. More worried than ever was Marmaduke. "How can I get in that sleigh?" he asked the imp of a stranger. "I'm too big." The little chap only chuckled. It was a mischievous chuckle. Then he said, "Take a good look at yourself." Marmaduke did. My, how he had shrunk! He was no bigger than a brownie, no bigger himself than the Toyman's thumb. "How did that happen?" he said. "Oh, the Dream Fairy did that," said Jack. "She likes to play tricks on people. It's lots of fun. But shake a leg! Shake a leg!" With that he took the reins himself, and the bells jingled again, and the reindeer grew more eager every second, snorting impatiently. Once more Marmaduke looked down at himself. No, his eyes had made no mistake. He was small enough now to sit on that little red seat with the tiny driver. So he popped out from the covers. The folds of the blanket looked as big as mountains, the lumps of the comforter as high as the hills. Over them he scrambled and he sprawled till he reached the little red and blue sleigh. Then he jumped in. The driver could be very imprudent, but he took good care of Marmaduke just the same, for the boy had been very sick and might catch cold. So Jack pulled the white robe over his passenger's knees and tucked him in all snug and warm. "Gee up! Gee up!" he called to the tiny reindeer. Marmaduke was frightened. What a horrible crash there would be when they slid from the high bed to the floor. But nothing like that happened at all. Away off the bed, over the bright rag carpet, and past the red fire, safely and swiftly they trotted. Below the window they paused. Pretty silver ferns and trees covered the panes, and sparkled in the firelight. The window was closed, but that did not matter at all. "Up with you!" yelled Jack Frost. Slowly, as if by magic, up went the window sash. Over the sill galloped the reindeer, and after them ran the toy sleigh with Jack Frost and Marmaduke on the red seat. Over the porch, too, they went. Then something did happen. "Now look at yourself," said Jack Frost, cracking his whip. Marmaduke did not hear him at first. He was admiring that whip. It was only a long icicle, and all Jack had to do was to touch the reindeer with its point to make them run faster and faster. "Look at yourself," he repeated. Marmaduke obeyed. "Why, I'm as big as I used to be." Jack laughed and replied, "The Dream Fairy does love to play tricks on folks." Yes, the sleigh had grown as large as his father's sleigh, the reindeer as big as Teddy, the buckskin horse. The tossing horns were as high as the reindeers in the zoo, and Jack Frost was as big as Jehoshaphat now. "I'm sorry that Jehoshaphat and Hepzebiah are not along," said Marmaduke to himself. "They're going to miss some fun." He looked ahead through the trees. Up over the hill the snow path stretched, up to the dark blue sky and the stars. Millions of them there were, and they were all twinkle winking at him. And the Old Man in the Moon, just over the hill, kept winking at him too. Jack Frost turned to Marmaduke. "Where would you like to go most?" Marmaduke didn't need to think. He had his answer all ready. "I'd like to visit the Old Man in the Moon." "It's a bit of a drive," replied Jack, "but Old Yellowhorns and Prancing Hoof are fast goers. Gee up! Gee up!" he shouted at them, touching their flanks with the icicle whip. So fast they went they scarcely seemed to touch the snow, and on up the hill they rode towards the laughing Man in the Moon. Then suddenly there came such a barking, a yelping, a neighing, a mooing, a clucking, a gobbling, a squealing, a squalling, as you never heard before. Around jerked Marmaduke's head. There behind the sleigh, running and leaping and paddling and waddling and frisking and scampering, came a strange procession. There were Rover and Brownie and little Wienerwurst, Teddy and Methuselah and all the horses, Primrose, Daisy, Buttercup, Black-eyed Susan, and all the cows. He could see their tongues hanging out, it was so hard to keep up with the dogs and the horses. "Moo! Moo! Slow! Slow!" called the poor cows. And behind them ambled the sheep and the curly-tailed pigs, waddled the ducks and the geese, Miss Crosspatch the guinea hen and Mr. Stuckup the turkey, and, at the very end, all of the White Wyandottes, the fathers and the mothers and the little yellow children, and their grandfathers and grandmothers, and all their uncles and aunts, and their cousins, first, second, and third, every last one of them. My, what a fuss and a clatter they made! There was a long line of them stretching down the hill and down the white road over the snow. Marmaduke laughed and exclaimed to Jack Frost, "Why, they look just like the procession of the animals when they came out of the Ark." "Yes, I remember them," replied Jack, "and old Noah too. I used to pinch their ears and pull their tails o' nights." Marmaduke looked surprised. "You? Why, that was hundreds of years ago. You can't be as old as all that." But Jack only smiled a superior smile. "Sure I am. Why, I'm as old as the world." "Old as that man in the moon?" continued Marmaduke, and the odd little fellow replied, "Just as old." Marmaduke looked up at the moon sailing far above them, and the old man, sitting there on the moon mountain, nodded as much as to say that Jack was quite right. Now the sleigh reached the top of the hill, just where it touches the sky. Surely there they would stop. But no. "This sleigh can run on air just as well as on snow," the odd little driver explained. Another touch of the icicle whip, a jingle of bells, a snort from the reindeer, and they were off, off through the air towards the sailing moon. Marmaduke was so interested in looking up that he didn't see little Wienerwurst run ahead of all the animals. That doggie beat them all to the top of the hill, and when he came to the top he just jumped out in the air and landed safe on the runner of the sleigh, and curled up there and hid and didn't make any noise. It was very clear high up in the air, and Marmaduke looked down. The houses had shriveled all up. As small as Wienerwurst's own little house they seemed, and the trees were as small as plants in the garden. He looked down again. The earth was far below them. By the white steeple of the church they flew. In the steeple was a little window. The bell rope hung out. Jack jerked it as they went past. "Ding dong, something's wrong." So spoke the deep voice of the old bell. He was 100 years old, and such strange things had never happened in his life before. And the minister threw up his window and stuck his head out. And the minister's wife stuck her head, in her nightcap, out of the window too. And the sexton ran out in the snow in his shirt tail to see what was the matter. And all the other people in the farmhouses and in the town houses threw up their windows or ran out of doors to see where the fire was. Then, after looking all around the houses and barns and the haystacks, they looked up at the sky and saw Marmaduke in the sleigh, racing towards the moon. They were very funny, like little toy people, all looking up and pointing at the sky and all shouting at once. But Marmaduke didn't care. He was having the time of his life. Then a still stranger and funnier sight he saw. All the animals on the top of the hill, the horses, the dogs, the cows, the sheep, the pigs, the ducks, the geese, the turkeys, and the White Wyandottes, all sitting on their haunches and barking or neighing or howling or squawking at Marmaduke as on, up and up he went, a-sailing through the sky. But he missed his little pet doggie. Where could he be? He was worried about that until all of a sudden he heard a little bark and looked behind, and there on the red runner, hanging on for dear life, was little Wienerwurst. Marmaduke reached down and picked him up by the scruff of his neck and set him on his lap under the robe so that he wouldn't catch cold. So Wienerwurst too had the time of his life, and his little pink tongue hung out in delight as they raced toward the moon. They hadn't gone more than 100 miles or so when something strange floated past them. A cloud, all puffy and soft and white, like the floating islands in the puddings Mother makes. The reindeer nearly ran into it. That would have been too bad, for the sleigh would have torn it in two. And as they passed, Marmaduke saw little baby angels lying there, curled up in the cloud fast asleep, with their wings folded. A whole fleet of the clouds passed by, and there was only clear air ahead of them, they thought. But no! Bang! They had bunked into something high up in the sky. "Very careless," said Jack Frost as he pulled on the reins. It was very bright, and Marmaduke blinked hard. Ahead of them lay another island, but this one was round and flat and shiny like a gold shield, with a little hill in the center. And there upon the hill sat a jolly old man, round and fat, with a pipe in his mouth and a sack on his back. "Hello, old top," said Jack Frost. "Good evening, you mischief maker," replied the Man in the Moon. "What are you up to now?" "Oh, I've brought one of the little earth children to see you. This is Marmaduke Green. He's been sick, so I thought I'd give him a ride." "Ho, ho! That's it. You do someone a good turn now and then, after all." Then the old man turned to Marmaduke. "Howdy," he said. "I hope you'll get better very soon." "Thank you," replied Marmaduke politely. He was so well brought up that he didn't forget his manners, even up high in the sky. "Well, here's something to play with when you get back to Earth," said the Old Man in the Moon. and he reached his hand inside the sack on his back and pulled out a fistful of bright gold pennies. Oh, such a lot of them! Marmaduke reached for them, but alas, he was in too much of a hurry and they spilled out of his hand and rolled right over the edge of the moon. Down, down, down through the sky they dropped, past the stars and the clouds, down, down, down to earth. There were all the animals still on top of the hill, looking up at the moon, and one of the bright pennies landed on Black-eyed Susan's nose. She was a timid old cow and she was startled, and she was still more frightened at the howling, the barking, the squawking which the animals set up, one and all. So frightened was she that she jumped. So hard did she jump that she leaped way over the hill and over the clouds and the stars. "There's that critter again," complained the Man in the Moon. On, with her tail spread out behind her and her legs sprawling in the sky, came old Black-eyed Susan, straight towards them. Jack Frost and Marmaduke jumped back. The Old Man in the Moon moved a little too. They were afraid she would land on their toes. But she didn't. "She's still pretty chipper," observed the Old Man. "That's a great jump. 'Most beats the record." So it did, for she sailed right over them, coming down on the other side of the moon, hitting one poor little star on the way with her hoof, and putting out its light entirely. And down, down old Susan fell till she hit the earth and lay there, panting and mooing so loud that the people on earth thought it was thunder, and shut their windows tight for fear of the rain. "Well," said the Old Man in the Moon, blowing clouds of smoke from his pipe, "that's over. Now here's some more pennies. Be careful this time," he warned him. And from his sack he drew forth another great handful of gold pennies. How they did shine! But as Marmaduke reached for them, Jack Frost jiggled his elbow with his icicle whip, and again they rolled over the edge of the moon. And again Marmaduke was too eager. He ran after them, and Wienerwurst ran too, and when they reached the edge they couldn't stop themselves at all. They were falling, down, down through the sky. 100 somersaults they turned. Marmaduke tried to hold on to a cloud, but his hands went right through it. He tried to hold on to the stars, but he missed every one. Then suddenly, bang went his head against the church steeple, and all the stars danced. Then he woke. He looked around. Why, he was sitting up in the bed, his very own bed, by the red fire. It was just a trick of the dream fairies after all. But it was all right, for at the foot of the bed rested the little red and blue sleigh and the tiny reindeer, just as still could be. And at the side of the bed stood Father and Mother and the Toyman. They seemed very happy. End of the 15th night.